He buried his wife alone. He buried their dreams with her. But the barn whispered again, this time not with wind, but with the shivering breath of 4 children and a chance he thought he'd never get again. The wind slammed against the shutters hard enough to rattle the glass, but Daniel Cross didn't flinch. He was used to storms, used to silence. The house hadn't known laughter in years, not since Sarah's cough became blood and the blood turned to fever and the fever took her name from the world. It had been 3 winters since then. 3 winters and not a single voice but his own. He lit the lantern and set it by the hearth, though there was no real need. He'd already finished the chores, fed the animals, repaired the porch rail. Nothing left to do but sit and let the night pass. Another stretch of darkness, another reminder. Until the horses kicked up a fuss. It wasn't the usual startle of wind or passing coyote. This was the sound of fear. Daniel was already grabbing the rifle by the door before he'd even thought of it, stepping into his boots, shrugging on his coat. The cold slapped him across the jaw, biting and sharp, but it wasn't the storm that set his pulse going. Something was wrong. The barn doors creaked when he pushed them open. Inside, the lantern light caught dust and straw, the hum of scared animals, and then something else. A sound that didn't belong. A cough. A small one. Daniel moved closer. There, between the hay bales, curled up beneath a moth-eaten blanket and the broken remains of an old canvas tarp, were 4 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest, maybe 3, was pressed against the older girl's side, face buried, thin arms trembling. They didn't scream, they didn't move. Only the oldest lifted her head, and her eyes, dark and sunken, locked onto Daniel like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. "We're sorry," she whispered. Daniel lowered the rifle. For a moment he just stood there, staring at them like he'd stumbled on a dream he didn't trust. He looked past the ragged clothes, the frostbitten fingers, the bare feet tucked beneath their skirts, looked past the bruises and the broken lip and the way the little one wheezed in his sleep. He looked at their eyes, every one of them. Not one of them cried. "Come inside," he said, his voice cracked. "It's warmer." The girl didn't move. The middle 2, a boy with wild hair and a girl no older than 6, huddled tighter. Only the youngest stirred, his head tilting slightly, a whisper of sound escaping his lips. "Papa," he croaked, before going limp again. Daniel's breath caught. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He moved forward, slid his arms beneath the boy and cradled him carefully, lifting him with the gentleness of a man who had once held his own child who never took her first breath. The other 3 followed, not because they trusted him, but because they had no other choice. Inside, he lit every lamp he had. He stoked the fire until it roared. He fetched blankets, laid them across the floor, and pressed a mug of warm water into the girl's hands. Only after the color started to return to their cheeks did he ask, "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "Mary." "And them?" She looked over her shoulder as if expecting the answer to come from somewhere else. "That's Tom, the boy with wild hair. Clara, the 6-year-old with the ribbon tied tight in her curls. And Jamie, he's the baby." "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer, not at first, then, gone. Daniel didn't push. He just nodded and went to the stove. They ate in silence, crumbs on plates, spoons scraping bowls. Jamie woke long enough to swallow a few sips of broth before drifting again. That night Daniel sat in the rocker by the fire, staring at the shape of 4 sleeping children bundled on his floor. The storm howled. The windows wept. But the house had never felt less empty. He didn't sleep. Come morning, the questions returned. "Mary," he said quietly, as he handed her a fresh pair of socks from Sarah's old drawer, "you said your parents were gone. What happened?" She clutched the fabric. "They died," she said, then, after a beat, "not all at once, but close enough." "Where were you going?" "Anywhere." How long have you been walking? Mary stared at the floor. A long time. Daniel nodded. It was enough for now. He fixed the barn with fresh straw. He set up cots near the hearth. He boiled water, taught Tom how to sweep, watched Clara chase dust motes across the kitchen while Jamie clung to his shirt hem and refused to be put down. By the third day, Mary spoke more. Not much, but enough to tell him they'd escaped an uncle's shack, enough to explain why Jamie flinched at raised voices, enough to justify why none of them ever asked for seconds, no matter how hungry they were. And Daniel, who had buried dreams with Sarah, who had learned to live alone because life never gave him a child of his own, felt something crack open. He caught himself setting 4 plates instead of 1. He started leaving the rocker in the corner, because Jamie preferred to fall asleep on his chest. He mended Mary's coat, let Clara pick a ribbon from Sarah's old sewing box, and taught Tom how to clean the rifle, not because he wanted him to shoot, but because Tom needed to learn how to be careful. One night the rain came instead of snow. Spring lingered in the scent of it. Daniel stood on the porch, listening to the wind die when he felt a tug at his sleeve. It was Jamie. He reached his arms up without a word. Daniel lifted him. The boy stared at the stars for a long while, head nestled against Daniel's neck. Then, in a whisper no louder than a leaf, "Papa." Daniel didn't answer right away. His throat didn't work. But when Jamie looked up, eyes wide and waiting, Daniel managed a nod. "Yes," he said softly, "I'm here." Inside, Mary watched from the doorway. Tom stood beside her. Clara tugged at her hand. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It didn't happen all at once, of course. There were nights of nightmares, mornings of silence. There were days when Mary sat on the porch for hours, staring down the road like she expected it to rise up and swallow them all. But they stayed. And Daniel let them. He found himself rearranging the attic into bedrooms, building shelves for books. He caught himself humming when he lit the stove. Then one afternoon, as he was chopping wood, a shadow crossed the yard. A rider. Alone. Daniel's grip tightened around the axe handle. The rider dismounted slow. A man maybe in his 40s, weathered face, long coat, and a badge that gleamed faint beneath the dust. "Marshal," he said. Daniel nodded. Something wrong. The marshal glanced toward the house, looking for a group of children, 4, been missing a few weeks now. Daniel's stomach turned. "They with you?" the marshal asked. Daniel didn't answer. He looked at the house, at the curtains fluttering where Mary had just vanished from view, at the faint giggle of Clara muffled behind the door, at the scratch of Tom's boots on the stairs. "Depends what you want with them," Daniel said at last. The marshal didn't blink, "Just want to know they're safe." Daniel stepped aside. "You can ask them yourself." The marshal didn't enter with force. He didn't draw a weapon. He just nodded and walked toward the porch. And Daniel followed. The moment the marshal stepped through the door, the air thickened with something sharp and fragile. It wasn't tension in the way of guns drawn or fights about to break, but something deeper, older, worn into the bones of the children huddled just out of sight. Mary had Clara pressed to her side like a shield. Tom stood half a step ahead of them, fists clenched like he didn't care that the man wore a badge, and Jamie had ducked behind the old rocking chair, his thumb in his mouth, eyes wide and unblinking. The marshal saw them and stopped cold. His face didn't harden, didn't soften either. He simply looked like a man seeing ghosts. Mary stepped forward before Daniel could say a word. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice low but firm. "Please don't make us go back." The marshal looked at her, slow and deliberate. "Nobody's here to take you, sweetheart." Mary didn't look convinced. Daniel moved closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder, not to push her forward, not to hush her, just to let her know he was there, still standing behind her. "Marshal," Daniel said, keeping his voice even, "these kids showed up near frozen in my barn. No food, no shoes, and bruises in places I don't think I want to ask about. If someone's come to claim them, I'll need to know what kind of claim it is." The marshal nodded once, pulled a folded slip of paper from his coat. "Missing persons notice. Town over. Man named Ellis reported his brother's kids ran off after the oldest girl set a fire in the wood stove." Mary stiffened. "It wasn't a fire," she said, barely above a whisper. "He threw the lantern at me." The room was quiet enough to hear the stove pop. Daniel didn't flinch. "You investigate that claim." The marshal's jaw worked. "Came late. Place was half burnt out when we arrived. Ellis said he hadn't laid a hand on them, but neighbors said they heard screaming. Found shackles on the back wall. We were looking to place the kids in a home, but they vanished before we got there." Mary's shoulders dropped slightly, but her voice didn't waver. "He kept us locked up. Said Mama ran off, but we know better." "She didn't run," Tom said. "He buried her." That was when the marshal took off his hat and looked Daniel in the eye. "Truth is, I don't think they should be handed back to any blood relation. I'm just here to find out if they're safe." "They are," Daniel said, simple and solid. The marshal looked around. At the fire, the blankets folded neatly, the patched clothes, the homemade stew simmering on the stove. At the way Clara clung to Mary, how Jamie still refused to let Daniel out of his sight. He took all that in like a man counting blessings he hadn't expected to find. Then he nodded. "You willing to make it formal?" the marshal asked. "Foster on paper guardianship, whatever the courts need." Daniel's chest rose slowly. "Yes." "You'll need to come to town, sign some things, maybe answer a few questions. They might ask about your wife." Daniel gave a tight nod. "I'll bring them." The marshal turned to Mary. "You all right with this, little miss?" Mary hesitated, then quiet sure she nodded. The marshal tucked the paper back into his coat. "Then I'll be back in 3 days. You'll ride in with me. We'll make it right." He paused at the door. "You're doing a good thing, Mr. Cross." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the door shut, the room exhaled. Mary let go of Clara. Tom unclenched his fists. Jamie finally came out from behind the chair and reached for Daniel's leg, burying his face against him. Later that night, Mary stood on the porch as the sun bled into the horizon. Daniel stepped up beside her, leaning on the rail, listening to the creak of the old wood beneath their weight. "You ever have any kids?" she asked. Daniel took a moment. "Tried. Sarah, my wife, she wanted them more than anything. We prayed, waited, but the Lord had other plans. She passed before we ever saw it happen." Mary didn't speak, but she nodded slowly, like she'd known some version of that pain too. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was too," he answered. They watched the sun dip behind the hills. "But I think," he said, voice low, "maybe he just wanted me to wait a little longer." The days that followed were a blur of things half forgotten and freshly learned. Mary took over the sewing, threading buttons with delicate fingers that trembled less now. Tom helped mend the fence, swung a hammer with stubborn strength, and looked up with pride every time Daniel said "good job." Clara arranged wildflowers in old mason jars, humming half-remembered lullabies. And Jamie followed Daniel like a shadow with small hands, big eyes, and trust that made Daniel's chest ache. They packed up for the trip to town, though the idea of leaving the land, this safe, quiet place, made Mary frown. "Just a day," Daniel said, "then we come home." He hadn't called any place home since Sarah. Now it felt right. The trip was quiet, save for Clara's occasional giggle and Jamie's endless questions. The marshal met them at the town edge and led the way. No cuffs, no courtroom, just an office with papers, a judge with a kind face, and a woman who worked for the county that called the kids wards before quickly changing to Mr. Cross's foster children. The judge raised a brow. "You sure, Mr. Cross, this is a lifetime decision?" Daniel didn't hesitate, so was marrying Sarah. That answer was enough. They stayed the night at a boarding house near the chapel. The children hadn't slept in real beds with feather pillows in as long as they could remember. Jamie burrowed so deep under the covers only the top of his curls showed. Mary stayed awake long after the others slept, staring at the ceiling like she didn't believe it was real. The next morning, as they rode back, the clouds gathered. Halfway home, the first drops fell. Then came the wagon. Daniel saw it from the bend, a splintered rig, one wheel off the axle, smoke curling from the wood like someone had fired too close. A figure stood beside it. Tall, rough coat, wide brim hat pulled low. Another man leaned against the wheel, blood dark on his shirt. The first man turned as they approached. His face twisted slowly into something dark. "Well," he said, "ain't this a sight?" Mary's breath hitched. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Uncle Ellis." Daniel stepped down from the wagon. "Stay here," he told the children. Ellis tilted his head. "You the one stole my property." Daniel didn't blink. "They're not property." Ellis spat. "Blood is blood." Daniel's hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "And yours is about to be shed if you take another step toward them." Behind him, the marshal's horse rounded the bend. He hadn't ridden off yet, must have known something might go wrong. Ellis caught sight of the badge and cursed under his breath. "They're mine," he said lower now, eyes darting. "They're under my protection," the marshal replied. "Judge signed it yesterday." Ellis drew. But Daniel was faster. The shot cracked the sky. Ellis dropped to his knees, clutching his hand, blood blooming from between his fingers. The second man, likely drunk, likely wounded, didn't move. The marshal dismounted and cuffed Ellis himself. "Guess you just proved what kind of man you are," he muttered, dragging him toward his horse. Mary didn't speak until Ellis was out of sight. Then she climbed down, stepped up to Daniel, and did something she hadn't done in all the days since she arrived. She hugged him. Tight. And Daniel, rough, weathered, half-broken Daniel, hugged her back. Clara came next, then Tom, then Jamie, arms locked around his neck as if he'd never let go again. They rode home in silence, but it wasn't empty. That night Daniel stood at the door of the attic, watching them sleep. 4 children in a house that had known only sorrow. And for the first time in years he wept. Not for what he lost, but for what he'd found. The day after Ellis was hauled off, the house settled into a quiet Daniel hadn't known since before Sarah died. Not silence, there were too many voices for that now, but a kind of stillness in the soul, peace maybe, or its rough cousin. The kind that comes after surviving something you didn't think you could. Jamie was the first to wake. He crawled out from under his quilt and padded barefoot across the floor, straight to Daniel's room, dragging his worn blanket behind him. He didn't knock, just pushed the door open and stood there until Daniel looked up from lacing his boots. "Mornin', Jamie. Can I feed the chickens with you?" Daniel smiled. "Sure thing." That morning they went out together. Jamie's small hand wrapped tight around Daniel's 2 fingers, his sleepy head bobbing with each step. Daniel didn't say much, just pointed things out, the way to open the coop gate, how to scatter the feed in wide arcs so the hens didn't peck each other. Jamie nodded like it was scripture. "I want to name that one," he said, pointing to a speckled hen with a crooked toe. "What'll you call her?" "Sarah." Daniel froze just for a breath. "Why Sarah?" Jamie shrugged. "It's a pretty name." Daniel knelt beside him, looked him straight in the eye. "It is. She was my wife. You didn't know that." Jamie blinked. "Oh." Then he leaned in, hugged Daniel tight around the neck. "I bet she would have liked me." Daniel held him longer than necessary. "She would have loved you," he whispered. Inside, Mary was fixing breakfast. Not just bread and jam, but eggs, fried potatoes, and even thick slices of ham Daniel had salted and stored the winter before. She wore an apron that swallowed her frame and moved around the kitchen like she'd done it her whole life. Clara stood on a stool beside her, giggling as she tried to crack eggs without breaking the yolks. Tom sat on the porch steps, sharpening an old stick with a knife Daniel had shown him how to use, slow, careful, always away from the body. He wasn't angry anymore, just watchful, protective in a way that didn't carry tension but quiet resolve. They had, all of them, fallen into a rhythm. That afternoon, Mary approached Daniel while he mended a section of the fence that the storm had rattled loose. "Do we go to school now?" she asked, eyes squinting against the sun. Daniel paused, wiped his forehead. Hadn't thought that far yet. "They'll want us to," she said, tone unreadable. "You want to?" She looked down at her shoes. "I'd like to learn to read better, and Clara should start soon. Jamie too." Daniel nodded. "There's a schoolhouse about 4 miles from here. Miss Kelter runs it. She's strict but fair. I can ride in and speak to her." Mary hesitated. "What if people talk?" "About what?" "Us, you, a man with no wife and 4 kids that aren't his." Daniel stood, not with anger but with purpose. "They can say what they want. God knows the truth. That's enough for me." Mary didn't reply, but something eased in her face. She turned to go, then paused. "Tom said maybe he doesn't want to go, not yet." "That's all right too. He can take his time." The next day, Daniel rode into town. Miss Kelter remembered him. She had white streaks in her hair now, but her posture was straight as ever. "You always said you wanted a house full of kids, Daniel," she said, signing the last of the papers. "Took the long way round, didn't you?" Daniel smiled. "Didn't think I'd ever get there." "Well," she said, her voice softening, "looks like God wasn't finished with you after all." He thanked her and left with the school books she offered, promising to bring the children by the next week. But back at the ranch, something had changed. The gate was open. Daniel stopped the wagon before it even reached the house. His pulse quickened. He saw the front door swinging. Jamie's small blanket, the one he carried everywhere, lay crumpled in the dirt. He jumped from the seat and ran. Inside, chaos. Chairs knocked over, a glass shattered, the stove still warm but the fire gone cold. No voices. "Mary," he called. "Tom, Clara." Silence. Then a noise, a sharp yelp. From the barn. Daniel grabbed his rifle from behind the door and sprinted. The barn doors were ajar. He kicked them open. And froze. Clara sat huddled in the corner, arms around Jamie, tears streaking her face. Tom stood between them and a stranger, a man with a coat too fine for these parts, a trimmed beard, and the unmistakable look of someone used to taking things not offered. "Step away from them," Daniel said, voice low and cold. The man turned, smiled. "Well now, you must be the noble rancher." Daniel did lower the rifle. "You've got 3 seconds." "I only need 2, the man said. He reached into his coat, not for a weapon but for papers. "I'm lawyer to Mr. Ellis," he said, holding them up. "Despite his legal troubles, he's filed a custody claim with the county, claims these children were wrongfully taken." Daniel stepped closer. "He assaulted a marshal, tried to draw on me. He's lucky to still be breathing." "Ah, but custody and criminal charges run on separate tracks," the man said, smug. "And there's still blood relation to consider." Tom moved slightly, placing himself between Clara and the man's shadow. Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. "You've made your point, now get off my land." The man arched a brow. "You're making a scene." "I'll make a grave if I have to." Just then footsteps, the marshal. Again, at the exact moment he was needed. "You're done here," the marshal barked, hand on his sidearm. "That man tries to push this. I'll have it thrown out before the ink dries." The lawyer turned, slightly rattled now. "I'll report this, all of it." "You do that," the marshal said, "and next time try knocking." The man left. The marshal watched him go, then turned to Daniel. "I thought he might try something. That's why I stayed in town. Figured you might need backup." Daniel exhaled slowly. His shoulders dropped. "Thank you." Later, when the sun dipped again and Clara finally stopped crying, Mary came down from the hills. She'd run at the first sound of shouting, carrying a small knife and a heart bigger than her years. She dropped it when she saw they were safe. "I should have been here," she said, angry at herself. Daniel knelt in front of her. "You did what you could. You always do." Jamie came up beside them, took Daniel's hand again. "Are we gonna have to leave?" "No," Daniel said. "No one's gonna take you from me." That night as they sat around the fire, Daniel reached for a tattered old photo from a drawer. It was Sarah, young, soft smile, eyes kind. "She prayed for you," he said, "for all of you, long before you got here." Tom looked up. "She didn't know us." "She didn't have to." Mary reached out and took the photo, holding it gently. "She feels like ours too," she said. "She is," Daniel replied. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the cracks of the old house. And for the first time since Sarah died, Daniel read aloud from the Bible, just a verse, a promise. Because now the house wasn't filled with silence anymore. It was filled with the sound of healing. The weeks that followed settled into something Daniel had never quite known, something between chaos and comfort. The children didn't just exist in his house anymore. They lived in it. Laughed, cried, argued, forgave. They left their marks, scuffs on the walls, crumbs in the corners, muddy prints on the porch, but also their warmth, their prayers at night, their shy smiles that grew bolder each day. He found himself adjusting not just his routines, but his expectations, his patience, his very understanding of what it meant to have a home again. School began with awkward goodbyes at the gate. Mary walked beside Clara, hand on her shoulder, while Jamie trailed behind kicking dust. Tom refused to ride into town at first, said he'd wait, said he didn't trust strangers with what was left of his little brother. Daniel didn't force it. He understood. Trust wasn't something boys like Tom gave out freely. Instead, Tom helped with the cattle and mending the sheds. He had a strength in him Daniel admired, not just in muscle but in spirit. Quiet, observant, dependable. He didn't speak much unless spoken to, but when he did, it was worth listening. One evening, after a long day of work, Tom sat beside Daniel on the porch, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. "You miss her?" Tom asked, not looking up. Daniel blinked. "Sarah." Tom nodded. "Every day." Tom didn't say anything else. He just nodded again and kept sharpening. It wasn't until Daniel rose to go inside that Tom said, "I think she'd like what you're doing now. Not many men would have stayed when it got hard." Daniel looked at him. The boy didn't look back, but Daniel could see it. The softening, the unspoken gratitude wrapped in that rare piece of vulnerability. He put a hand on Tom's shoulder, and they sat together until the stars came out. But healing isn't linear. It comes in waves, and sometimes it recedes. One night Jamie screamed. Daniel burst into the room with his rifle in hand, only to find Jamie thrashing under his blanket, sobbing and gasping for air. Clara clung to him, whispering his name, trying to wake him. Mary stood frozen near the door, her eyes wide. "It's okay," Daniel said, setting the rifle down and moving toward them. "It's a night terror, happens sometimes." Jamie wouldn't wake. He kept whispering a name, Elia's, over and over like a prayer or a curse. Daniel wrapped him in his arms and held him tight. "SHHH, I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe now, nothing can get to you here." Eventually Jamie's cries faded. His breathing slowed. He fell back into a trembling sleep. Daniel stayed there most of the night, Jamie curled against his chest, the others dozing nearby. In the quiet, Mary whispered, "Elia's was the baby." Daniel looked over. "Baby." She nodded. There were 5 of us before the barn. He didn't make it. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. A few days later, a letter arrived. It bore the county seal, official. Daniel read it on the porch, jaw tightening with each word. The lawyer hadn't given up. He'd filed a formal petition with the court. It would go before a judge in 2 weeks. "Wants to make a show of it," the marshal said when Daniel rode to town with the letter in hand. "Claims Ellis has a sister who'll take them all in. Says he's trying to correct the injustice." Daniel snorted. "He's trying to save face." "Well," the marshal said, "either way, you need to prepare. Judge Carson's a fair man, but he'll want proof you're the best place for them." "What kind of proof?" The marshal shrugged. "You've got neighbors, don't you? Folks who have seen the change in you and in the children. Bring them. Let M speak." Daniel nodded. He could do that. What he couldn't do was make the waiting any easier. The news hit the kids differently. Mary went silent, folding inward. Clara wept, then asked if she could sleep in Daniel's room that night. Jamie clung to Mary, asking every hour if they were leaving. "But Tom exploded. "He can't take us," he shouted, slamming a door. "He doesn't want us, he wants control." Daniel didn't argue. He knew Tom was right. "We'll fight it," he said calmly, "and we'll pray." That night the children gathered in the living room and Daniel knelt with them in front of the fireplace. He led the prayer, but they all spoke. Clara asked God not to let them go. Jamie said he wanted to live where the chickens were. Mary asked for strength. And Tom, after a long silence, whispered, "I just want a real dad." Daniel's throat closed, but he forced himself to speak. "You've got one," he said, "right here." The hearing loomed. Time passed too quickly. Daniel rode to every ranch and homestead in a 10-mile radius. He spoke to men and women who'd known him for decades. Some offered words. Others came to visit the children, to remind them they weren't alone. One of those was Mrs. Bellows, the widow who'd helped Daniel through Sarah's death. She brought a pie and kindness. "They're good kids," she said, watching Jamie chase a chicken through the yard. "And you're a better man than you think." Daniel smiled weakly. "I'm just trying to keep up." The day before the hearing, a storm rolled in, fast and brutal. The kind that swallows the sky in dust and makes everything feel uncertain. They stayed inside, lit lamps early, and read aloud from Psalms. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Daniel read the words slowly, deliberately, his voice low. Jamie leaned against his arm. The next morning they rode into town in a borrowed wagon. Daniel wore his best coat. The children were washed and solemn. The courthouse loomed larger than any of them remembered. Inside, the judge looked over his glasses and spoke with measured calm. The lawyer made his case. About blood ties, about the sister who had a bigger house, a piano, even a governess. Daniel stood, hand steady. "I may not be kin," he said, "but I'm the one who held them when they screamed, who taught them to read, who braided Clara's hair when she missed her mama too much to sleep." He looked at each child. "And they chose me." The judge listened, asked questions, took notes. Finally, he nodded. "I'll render a decision by week's end." The courtroom emptied slowly. The lawyer passed Daniel with a sneer. "This isn't over." Daniel didn't reply. Back at the ranch, the children waited for the decision like it was a thunderhead in the distance, one they could hear but couldn't stop. The day it arrived, the marshal rode out himself. He handed Daniel the envelope and said nothing. Daniel opened it in the kitchen, heart pounding. Then he smiled. He read it aloud. "Custody awarded permanently to Mr. Daniel Kane, in recognition of moral guardianship, environmental stability, and emotional welfare." Clara screamed with joy. Jamie ran in circles. Tom grinned, wide and real for the first time. Mary stood still, blinking, then said, "We're staying." Daniel nodded. She ran into his arms and wept. That night they had a feast. Nothing fancy, just fresh bread, stew, and pie, but it tasted better than anything they'd had in months. As the stars filled the sky and laughter echoed across the porch, Daniel stepped away, alone for a moment. He looked up, eyes wet. "Thank you," he whispered. Then small footsteps. He turned. It was Clara, her hair wild from running. "Papa?" she asked. Daniel froze. She stepped closer. "Can I call you that now?" Daniel knelt. "I'd be honored." She threw her arms around his neck. From the doorway Tom watched. Then Mary. Then Jamie. And without another word, they all joined in. A pile of arms and tears, and something new being born. Family not of blood but of choice, of grace, of healing. And the door stayed open long into the night. The weeks after the court ruling unfolded like a second spring. Not the kind marked by blossoms or new crops, but by a quiet, rooted peace that only comes after a long stretch of drought. Daniel Kane moved differently through his home now, not because of pride or victory, but because the weight that had pressed on him since the night he found those children sleeping in his barn had lifted. What remained was a deeper weight, a sacred one, the weight of being called Papa. Clara used the word freely now, sometimes shyly, sometimes like it had always belonged to her. Jamie followed suit, testing it out like a new pair of boots, sometimes whispering it into Daniel's shoulder when he hugged him good night. Mary hadn't said it yet, not aloud, but she lingered when Daniel spoke, looked for his nod of approval when she helped in the kitchen, and always reached for his hand when they crossed the stream behind the house. Tom was slower, careful, guarded but not cold. He still called Daniel by name, but he didn't flinch anymore when Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't tense up when Daniel stood too close. There was trust now, earned inch by inch, steady and unspoken. They worked side by side every morning, mending fences and tending the horses. Sometimes they didn't say a word for hours, but the silence between them had shifted. It was comfortable now. It was safe. Then came the letter. It arrived in the middle of a storm. Rain poured down the roof in thick sheets. Clara and Jamie were coloring by lamplight. Mary was kneading bread, and Tom was sanding a piece of wood he planned to carve into a whistle. Daniel opened the door to grab a bundle of firewood, and there it was, half-soaked in rain, wedged under a rock on the porch. The envelope had no return address, just his name, written in shaky pencil. He opened it slowly, unsure why his stomach tightened the way it did. Inside was a single piece of paper. It read, "I know where they came from. I was there when the last one died. If you want the truth, meet me where the well broke. Midnight, come alone." There was no signature. Daniel read it twice, heart thudding louder each time. He didn't say anything to the children. He tucked the letter in his coat pocket and returned to the fire, but his mind raced. The well that broke, that had to mean the old irrigation site north of town, the one that dried up 5 years ago and left a patch of nothing but cracked earth and rusted piping. He should ignore it. He had what mattered. The children were safe. The court had ruled. But the words "I was there when the last one died" wouldn't stop echoing. Elias. The baby. Daniel didn't sleep that night. When midnight came, he saddled his horse and rode out alone. The wind cut through the plains like a warning. Thunder grumbled in the distance. He reached the broken well and waited, lantern in hand, the light flickering like a heartbeat. Minutes passed, then footsteps, soft, cautious. A man stepped into view. Thin, stooped, wrapped in a coat far too big for him. His face was partially hidden by a scarf, but his eyes were sharp. "You came," the man said. Daniel didn't reply, just narrowed his eyes. "I'm not here to take them. I don't want anything," the man said. "I just want to confess." Daniel stiffened. "Confess what?" The man swallowed. I was with Ellis when it happened, when Elias died. The air changed. Daniel stepped forward. You were with him. The man nodded. I worked the cattle run, helped him move the herd east. He said he was traveling light, just him and the kids, said he was gonna make a new life. Daniel's hands curled into fists. You stood by and let a baby die. The man looked down. I didn't know how bad it was at first. He talked smooth, said the kids were fine, they looked quiet, well-behaved, but they weren't well, not inside, not fed. The little one, he stopped crying one night, just stopped. We buried him near a dry creek. Daniel's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He said if I told anyone I'd be next, the man added, voice shaking now. But I couldn't keep it in anymore. I see that baby's face every time I close my eyes, and I heard about you, how you took the kids in. I thought you should know. Daniel stared at him. Where? He asked. What? Where's the grave? The man nodded slowly. I'll take you. They rode in silence, Daniel's hands white around the reins. Dawn crept up behind them, casting the sky in pale blue as they reached the place, a patch of brittle earth beneath a twisted tree. No marker, no stone, just wind and the faint shape of a mound, barely visible now. Daniel dismounted. He knelt, said nothing for a long time. Then, Lord, I never knew him, but you did. I believe he's in your arms now. The wind stilled. Daniel stood. He deserves a marker. The man nodded. Daniel picked up a stone, heavy and flat, and placed it on the mound, then another. The man joined in. Neither spoke, but the pile grew, not just stones but memory, honor, a promise. Back at the ranch, Clara met him at the gate. Where were you? Paying respects, Daniel said softly. She didn't ask more, just walked beside him, her hand in his. Life resumed. Jamie learned to tie his shoes and bragged about it to the chickens. Mary began writing poetry, scrawling lines in a notebook Daniel found tucked between the couch cushions. Clara kept drawing, mostly flowers, sometimes the barn with 4 little figures beneath it, and a man with a beard standing in the doorway. And Tom built the whistle. It didn't sound great, but Jamie loved it. Daniel started planning again, late season, but he had hope. The garden bloomed slow, stubborn, faithful, just like them. But then, a knock at the door. Daniel opened it to find a woman in her 30s, traveling coat dusty, hat askew. Her eyes locked on Mary, who stood behind Daniel with a bowl of flour in her hands. The woman's lip trembled. Mary. Mary froze, then dropped the bowl. Ma, she whispered. The woman burst into tears. Daniel caught her as she stumbled forward. Inside, she explained everything, how she'd escaped Ellis a year before, how he'd told her the children had died, how she'd searched every town between here and the Rio Grande. Then, weeks ago, she'd seen a drawing, a child's sketch of a man with a beard and 4 kids under a barn roof, tacked up in the general store. Clara's. Daniel listened, stunned. Mary didn't move. Why didn't you come for us? She asked, voice cracking. I did, the woman sobbed, but he told me you were gone. Daniel sat down. There were decisions to make, hard ones. The woman, her name was Ruth, was the children's mother, not of them all but of Mary and Jamie by birth. Clara and Tom had come later, taken in by Ellis when their own parents passed or fled. Daniel had known their backgrounds were murky, but he hadn't asked much. It hadn't seemed to matter. Until now. I want them back, Ruth said softly, at least the ones who are mine. Mary stared at the floor. Jamie ran to her and hugged her tight. But Clara stepped back. Tom crossed his arms. I don't want to go, Clara said. Neither do I, Tom added. Daniel watched Ruth. She didn't push, just nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. I just want them safe, even if it's not with me. Daniel's heart broke all over again. They spoke long into the night. And in the end, Ruth stayed, not to take them, just to visit, to be present, to know them again. It was strange at first. Mary kept her distance, unsure how to forgive. Jamie clung to both Daniel and Ruth, torn in ways no boy should have to be. Clara asked questions. Ruth answered them honestly. Tom listened. One evening, as Daniel repaired the porch rail, Ruth stepped beside him. "You saved them," she said. "I just kept them warm," he said. "No, you saved them." She handed him something, her wedding band. "I want you to have this, not because I don't love them, but because I know where they belong now." Daniel shook his head. She pressed it into his palm. "Keep it for Mary, for Jamie. Maybe one day she'll want it." He didn't argue. That night Mary said, "She's not perfect, but she's trying." Daniel nodded. "I think we all are." A week later, Ruth left. She kissed each child, hugged Daniel, and promised to write. And then, life settled again. But something had changed. Clara started calling him Papa more often. Jamie called him that every day. And one night, after tucking the kids in, Tom stepped into the kitchen. He looked nervous. "I've been thinking," he said. Daniel waited. "I never had a father," Tom said. "Not a real one, but I think, if I did, I'd want him to be like you." Daniel's breath caught. "I don't need to call you Papa," Tom continued, his voice low, "but I just wanted you to know." Daniel stepped forward. "You can call me whatever you want, son. Just don't stop talking to me." Tom smiled, a small, tired, honest smile. Then something shifted. He whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Okay, Papa." Daniel pulled him into a hug. This boy, this strong, stubborn boy, had come home. They all had. The days that followed Tom's quiet acceptance felt like a soft breath after a long-held silence. In the kitchen, Daniel found himself humming hymns again, ones he hadn't dared hum since his wife passed. The sound of children playing outside no longer startled him. It soothed. There were boots by the door, toys on the rug, half-finished drawings on the table. The home that once echoed with absence now breathed life in every corner. Fall was creeping over the land, trading sunlight for golden leaves and chillier nights. Harvest came late that year, but the pumpkins grew fat and proud, the apples crisp, and the wind smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon from Clara's hand-rolled dough rising by the window. Ruth wrote as promised. Once a week, folded paper would arrive bearing letters to Mary and Jamie and short notes to Daniel, always ending in gratitude. She was in San Felipe now, working in a bakery, renting a small room over the shop. In one letter she enclosed a drawing Jamie had made of their house, a house with a crooked roof and too many windows, but 4 happy stick figures beneath it, and one tall figure holding them all. Daniel didn't say anything when Jamie showed it to him, but he kept the drawing, framed it even, quietly, hung it near the door. But peace never lasts long on this side of heaven. It began with the writer. Daniel spotted him on the ridge near dusk, just a silhouette against the amber sky, watching, not approaching. The next day the same man stood near the creek, again watching, then gone before Daniel could reach him. On the third day, Daniel saddled up before sunrise, rode out early, and waited near the ridge. The man arrived. He was lean, weather-worn, and dressed in travel gear, worn boots, canvas duster, wide hat. He didn't speak first, just looked Daniel over with flat, unreadable eyes. "You've been watching my land," Daniel said calmly, hand near his holster but not touching it. "I've been looking for something," the man answered. "What's that?" "Justice." Daniel stiffened. "For who?" "For the blood Ellis spilled." The wind shifted. Daniel kept still. "I ain't law," Daniel said. "No, but you're the man raising what's left of him." Daniel's voice dropped. They ain't his legacy. They carry his name. Not anymore. The man dismounted slowly. I was his brother. Daniel's hand dropped away from his belt, not because the threat vanished, but because the truth always hit harder than bullets. Name S. Levi, the man added. And before you say it, no, I didn't ride with him. I left before he became a monster. Daniel said nothing. I came to find the children. I didn't expect them to be here, but now that I've seen, I need to ask you something. Daniel waited. Can I speak to them? Daniel narrowed his eyes. Why? Because I need to tell them what kind of man he really was. Not just the cruelty, but the lies, the broken things he left behind. I need them to know he wasn't always like that, and I need to ask their forgiveness for not stopping him sooner. Daniel stared for a long while. Finally, you come tomorrow, around noon. We'll talk then. Levi nodded, thank you. Then he turned and walked back up the hill, disappearing into the evening light. Daniel didn't tell the children that night. He prayed on it instead. Long, slow prayers by the fire, asking for wisdom, for discernment, for the strength not to harden when fear returned knocking. Morning brought laughter and oatmeal and Jamie trying to chase a chicken barefoot. Clara helped sweep the porch. Mary fed the horses, and Tom stacked firewood higher than his head just to show off. At noon, Levi arrived. Daniel introduced him plainly, without drama. This man says he was Ellis' brother. He wants to speak with you. Silence. Mary's hands clenched into fists. Jamie shrank back. Clara stared hard. But Tom, ever the one to meet storms head-on, nodded once. All right, but not alone. They gathered in the living room. Levi stood near the hearth. I'm not here to excuse what he did, Levi began. Nothing can. I'm just here because I should have done something a long time ago. And because before Ellis turned cruel, he was my best friend, my big brother. He carried me through rivers, pulled me from a burning barn. He taught me to read. He paused. I watched that same brother twist, grow bitter. He drank too much, lost his wife, started hitting before he started hurting, and I left because I was scared, not of him, of what I might become if I stayed. Mary wouldn't look at him. I heard rumors years later, about him and a group of kids, about a baby that died. I didn't want to believe it, but when I did, I searched, found nothing, until last week. He looked at Jamie. I'm sorry, for every night he left you hungry, for every bruise, for every time he made you feel smaller than a man of God should. Then Clara. For the times he told you you were unwanted. Then Tom. For making you think you had to be a soldier, when all you were was a child. Finally Mary. For not being there when you needed someone to say enough. I should have come, I'm sorry. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of pain, of weight being set down. Mary spoke first. Why now? Because my own son just turned 9, Levi said, voice breaking. And I saw his eyes when he was scared of thunder, and I thought, if someone doesn't speak up now, it'll keep happening. Clara stood. We don't need you to tell us who Ellis was. We remember. Tom added, but it's good someone else does too. Jamie approached Levi slowly, then wrapped his arms around his waist. Levi knelt and cried. That night Levi stayed for supper. He left the next morning after promising to write and to return again someday, not as Ellis' brother, but as a man trying to be better. Autumn deepened. Mary began writing letters to Ruth more often, and sometimes Ruth wrote back with drawings Jamie had mailed her, drawings of Clara holding a rabbit, of Tom building a gate, of Mary smiling. One letter included a question. Would it be all right if I visited again at Christmas? Mary read it 3 times, then passed it to Daniel without a word. He folded it gently. Only if you want. I want her to see, Mary whispered, what love looks like. By the time snow kissed the fields, Daniel had finished carving a small cross from cedar. He returned to Eliah's grave alone one dawn, planted it deep in the earth and prayed, "Lord, keep watch over what I cannot, and thank you for what you brought to my door." Christmas came with quiet beauty. The ranch was trimmed with simple garland Clara wove herself. Tom chopped a tree and dragged it inside with Jamie riding on the branches. Mary made cinnamon bread from her own recipe, and Daniel pretended it was better than his wife's, just to see her grin. Ruth arrived on Christmas Eve, bringing gifts she couldn't afford and a pie she burnt by accident. No one cared. They sang hymns around the fire, Daniel leading in his low, steady voice. Ruth's voice cracked, but she joined anyway. Afterward, Ruth tucked Jamie in, then hugged Clara and Tom, who let her. Daniel and Mary stood by the fire. "She's not perfect," Mary said, "but she's mine." Daniel nodded, "And you're ours." Mary leaned into him. "I told her I already had a papa," she whispered. Daniel looked down at her. "And what did she say?" "She said she's glad." Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, peace reigned. Not perfect, not easy, but real, earned, and held tight. The snow stayed longer than expected. January came with hard winds that shook the roof and painted frost along the edges of every windowpane. It was a white world for weeks, muffled and still, broken only by the laughter of children bundled in coats 3 sizes too big. Daniel had built a sled from scrap wood and iron runners, and Clara painted it blue with flowers down the sides. Jamie named it Thunder. Every day they'd slide down the hill past the barn, tumbling into heaps of giggles and powdery snow. Mary, always the watchful one, often sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt, her gaze not distant anymore but peaceful. Sometimes she joined them, and when she did, Daniel swore he could hear the sound of healing. Tom spent much of the winter building things: birdhouses, shelves, a small stool for Jamie to reach the sink. Daniel gave him his old tools and taught him about measurements and angles, about how to plane a board smooth and drive a nail without splitting the wood. Tom never said much, but Daniel noticed how his shoulders slowly relaxed, how his eyes lifted more, how he no longer flinched at unexpected noises. Then one afternoon, just before February's thaw, Daniel brought something down from the attic, a box tied with frayed blue ribbon. He set it on the table where the children were playing. Tom tilted his head. "What's that?" Daniel's hands rested gently on the lid. "Memories," he said, "of my wife. Her name was Grace." Jamie stopped drawing. Clara leaned closer. Mary didn't move, but her eyes flicked toward it. "She couldn't have children. We tried, we prayed, we wept. When she died, I thought that prayer went with her." His voice trembled slightly. "But God answers in His own time. Sometimes He sends you what you never expected." He opened the box. Inside were photographs, dried flowers, a shawl with tiny embroidered lilies, and a leather-bound journal. On top lay a wooden rattle, still smooth with age. "I made that," Daniel whispered, holding it up. "Before we knew she couldn't carry, I kept it anyway." Clara reached out and touched the shawl. She liked lilies. Summer returned with sudden boldness. Grass tall and green again, creeks full and singing, the barn sweet with the scent of hay and life. And the house, that once felt too big for a single man's grief, now overflowed with noise, color, and motion. Every room bore fingerprints and muddy shoes, half-finished drawings, scraps of fabric, and dolls with missing buttons. Daniel Weller could barely walk 3 steps without stepping over a child or into a game in progress. He didn't mind. In fact, he felt younger now than he had at 30, when he was first told he'd never have a child. Grief had made him hollow once, but now every laugh, every Papa or Mr. Daniel, every small hand in his, filled those hollow places, one by one. The children were thriving. Mary had started a garden behind the house, rows of carrots, onions, and beans, all perfectly aligned. Lottie liked to plant wildflowers along the fence, calling them her secret meadow. Clara stitched dolls and mended socks like a little homemaker, but her real love was music. She'd hum softly when rocking Jamie to sleep. Jamie, of course, followed Daniel like a shadow, mimicking his stride, tipping his little hat at strangers, even trying to oil the gate latch when it squeaked. Tom still didn't say much, but he'd taken to whittling. Animals, mostly. Foxes, birds, a bear once that he gave to Owen. Owen painted it blue and red and set it on the windowsill beside his own carvings. Daniel caught them laughing together one night, heads pressed close under a lantern. Brothers, bonded not by blood but by the shared experience of suffering and survival. And then there was Eli, the small, soft-eyed boy who never let go of the baby Grace. She was crawling now, and she always found her way to Daniel's boots first thing in the morning. He'd lift her into the air and she'd giggle with that unfiltered, holy joy that only infants carry. It was the sound of God's mercy, Daniel often thought. A sound that cut through every hard thing he'd ever endured. The town began to talk, but in a good way. People at church stopped Daniel to shake his hand. One of the older women knitted a quilt for each child. Mr. Cartwright offered free milk from his dairy cow every week. Even the preacher, Reverend Shaw, once placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder in silent pity after Grace's funeral, looked at him differently now. "God's work you're doing," he said one morning after service, nodding toward the line of children racing through the grass outside the chapel. "I'm just catching up," Daniel replied. He didn't take credit. How could he? It was Grace through and through, not just the baby's name but the truth written in every breath of this new life. But peace was fragile. And one afternoon in late July, as cicadas buzzed and the fields shimmered with heat, peace was threatened. It started with a man on a horse. He rode up the road slow, eyes shielded under a wide-brim hat, coat too thick for summer. Daniel spotted him from the field and stiffened. There was something wrong in his posture, something too still. The man dismounted at the gate but didn't open it, just stared at the house. Daniel approached with calm steps, heart hammering under his ribs. "You lost?" he asked, voice firm. The man looked up. His face was scarred. A jagged line ran from brow to jaw, one eye milky and dead, but the other sharp, too sharp. "I'm looking for a boy," he said. "Name S. Owen." Daniel didn't answer. "He's mine," the man added. "Ran off, took the others too." Daniel's throat went tight. "They're not yours." The man laughed low. "Law might say otherwise." "They've been claimed legal, by me. Sheriff saw to it." The man's mouth curled into something half smile, half snarl. "Sheriffs don't always know everything." Daniel stepped forward, hand hovering near his sidearm. "Turn around." "You threatening me, old man?" "No, I'm telling you what God already made clear. You're not welcome here." Silence stretched. Then a voice broke it. "I ain't yours," Owen said. He stood behind the porch rail, hands balled into fists. Tom was beside him, face hard. The man blinked. "Boy, you hurt Mama. You locked us in that shed. You said God didn't hear cries at night, but he did." Lottie joined them, chin raised. "We prayed, he sent us here." The man's face twisted. "You ungrateful." Daniel stepped in front. "That's enough." The man hesitated. Something about Daniel, his steady posture, the quiet certainty, made him falter. Then from inside the house, a baby cried. The man's shoulders slumped. He got back on his horse, spat into the dust and muttered, "She'll ruin you like she ruined her mother." He rode off. Owen trembled, fists still clenched. Daniel laid a hand on his shoulder. "He won't be back," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. But Owen didn't question. He just leaned against Daniel's side for a long time, and when he pulled back, his voice cracked as he said, "Thanks, Papa." Daniel swallowed hard. He'd heard it before from Jamie and Clara, even once from Mary. But this was different. This was the boy who'd stayed silent, the one who stood at the edge of the family, unsure if he belonged. Now he knew. And Daniel did too. The land was his, the ranch, the barn, the orchard, but none of it ever truly lived until now. Autumn came golden and gentle. The air smelled of apples and wood smoke. Daniel built a tree swing. Jamie lost his first tooth. Clara taught the others a hymn Grace used to hum, and they sang it one evening at sunset, their voices drifting through the fields like a benediction. Come thou fount of every blessing. Even Tom sang. Daniel listened from the porch, hand over his heart, eyes wet. One day, Mary handed him a letter. I wrote to the orphan board, she said. Told them about the others, that they're safe, that we don't need help, that they're home. Daniel looked at her, then back at the house where Lottie and Clara were stringing corn husks, where Owen was helping Jamie saddle a wooden horse, where Eli held baby Grace like she was the world. Home. He nodded. Some days, he still visited the graves beneath the oak. Spoke to Grace. He detailed her about Jamie's new words, about how Mary had become like her big sister, about how Tom had carved a full nativity scene for the mantle. And he'd say, they call me Papa now. Then he'd smile and add, funny, isn't it, that we prayed for one and God gave us 9. He never felt lonely again. The barn doors stayed open through the winter, not because the wind was mild, but because the sound of children playing in the hay was better than silence. One night, as snow began to fall and supper filled the house with warmth, Daniel picked up baby Grace and kissed her soft hair. Then he turned to the table where they all sat, mismatched chairs, mismatched hearts, but whole at last. Let's give thanks, he said. And they did. Not just with words, but with every beat of their hearts, every quiet smile, every miracle that sat breathing under his roof. Because family isn't who you're born with. It's who you fight for. And in a broken world, love that chooses is the strongest kind of all. The end.